Scripture reading this evening will be from Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Once again, that's Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. There it says, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you."
Good evening. You know, the title of Brent's sermon this morning was "I'm Starting with the Man in the Mirror." I don't think that I speak for myself when I say I was a little disappointed you didn't sing that lyric for us, you know, as we're dealing with Michael Jackson there this morning. And I know Trevor was disappointed when he told me that after seeing the title of my sermon, he said, that's not a Michael Jackson song that I've ever heard of before. So, but we're starting off here in Matthew chapter 6 and verses 1 through 4, and I think we would do well if we started off by simply defining our terms this evening, because when I read the New King James Version, well, I'll just read verses 1 and 2 for you. In Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 and 2, it says, "Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them. Otherwise you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men." Now, the reason that I want to read that over again is because in verse 1, New King James Version says charitable deeds, but if you read verse 1 in most modern translations, such as New American Standard, it reads like this. It says, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven." And then again, it uses the term charitable deeds in verse 2 in most modern translations. So what's the words that are being used there? What does it say in the Greek? That's what we have to do in this type of situation, is we have to go back and look at the Greek and what does the Greek say, so that we can define our terms and see the words that are really being used here. And if we go and look at the Nestle-Olin text in the Greek, verse 1, the word that is being used there is dikaiosune, which refers to righteousness. So the word righteousness really would be an accurate term that we would use there for the word in verse 1. Again, it means righteousness, godliness, piety. But then if we go to verse 2, it's actually a completely different word that's being used in verse 2. And that word is eleemasune. And that refers to almsgiving, charitable giving, mercy, and kindness. It can refer to something such as giving money to the poor, or providing a meal, hospitality, helping the old lady across the street, you know, that kind of a thing. But what you do see here is you see a difference in words that is being used. You see charitable deeds, verse 2 is a very accurate term that we would use, but verse 1, the word that is really being used there is righteousness before God, godliness, that sort of a thing. So what do we conclude from that? Well, Jesus' desire is that our charitable deeds are also an act of righteousness before God, because he's not making a distinction between the two. And the fact of the matter is, as we read this text, as he tells us, take heed that you don't do or practice your righteousness before men to be seen by them, otherwise you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Then he goes on and says, therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. What Jesus is saying here is that our charitable deeds should also be acts of righteousness, but the possibility of that totally dissipates when we seek to have glory from men. So I want to start off with a question that we should be asking all of ourselves this evening, starting with why are you here this evening? Why am I up here preaching in front of you this evening? Why is it that when the collection plate goes around that we put money into it? Why is it that we go out and we talk about God and we talk about how we're religious? Why is it that we pray? Why is it that we sing praises? Are we doing these kinds of things to, well, for instance, showing up to church? Are we just here so that people will see that we're here? Or are we here to worship God and to grow our relationship with him? Are we singing praises to God to simply grace everybody with our beautiful voice? Or are we doing it to sing praises to God, our audience of one? Why are we here this evening? Because this is the kind of thing that we're talking about. We're talking about all acts of righteousness. In fact, Jesus goes on, and I know specifically he's using the example of charitable deeds here, but in chapter 6, as we go all the way through to verse 18, Jesus uses 3 examples of different acts of righteousness. He talks about charitable deeds, and then he goes on and he talks about praying, and then he goes on and he talks about fasting. And he addresses the same problem as he goes through all those different acts of righteousness. And the problem is, if you're doing these things to receive glory from men, then that's your reward, and you have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. And so Jesus uses these 3 examples so that we aren't confused about how we do things such as worship and perform good deeds in a righteous manner. He wants us to know how to do that. And the fact is that, understandably, some people, all they care about is the act itself. If you go and you give money to the beggar on the street, he doesn't care if you're doing that to impress your friends. He just cares that he got the money. But as we read the words of Jesus, and as Jesus preaches the Sermon on the Mount, he makes it very clear that when it comes to serving God, motives are everything. And so that's what we're talking about this evening, is that motives are everything. So when I say, as you see in the title, that we're to serve without ulterior motives, what I'm talking about is any motive that deviates from glorifying God. And so, again, motives are everything. And I just want to start off by reminding us what our purpose is. Don't forget what your purpose is when it comes to doing acts of righteousness. What does it say in Matthew chapter 5 and in verse 13 through 16? Jesus says, and we all are very familiar with this, he says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do you light a lamp and put it under a lampstand, nor do you light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." This is our underlying purpose in life. This is what it always comes back to. Our job is to glorify our Father who is in heaven. We do that by preserving and by shining our light into darkness and by doing good works so that others may come and glorify him. And I wanted to bring that out because I don't want us to be confused. Because as we're reading in chapter 6 now, what Jesus keeps on saying when he says, do your charitable deeds, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your good deeds may be done in secret. Or when he tells us to go and pray, he says, go into your room, and when you have shut your door, pray to your Father who is in the secret place. Or when you talk about fasting, he says, don't be like the hypocrites with a sad countenance who disfigure their faces so that they may appear to men to be fasting. But he says, anoint your head and wash your face so that when you fast, that only God is seeing that, so that you don't appear to be fasting before men. So I want us to understand that Jesus isn't contradicting himself here. What Jesus is doing in chapter 6 is he's addressing the root of the problem, which is the heart. What is our intention? What is our motivation for doing righteous deeds? That's what Jesus is addressing here. And what he says is that our intentions cannot be to seek glory from men. But we must have our hearts, when we're performing these acts of righteousness, our hearts must be with God in the secret place. And that it shouldn't make any difference who's watching. Whether there's people around or whether there's nobody around. That makes no difference, and we don't notice that. Rather, when there's an opportunity to do good, we do it, and we don't do it to seek glory from men. Because as you read through this, I don't want us to be confused and think that these deeds are inherently wrong. Of course they're not. These things were, I would say that they're the right act, but they had the wrong motive. Let's go back and look at verse 2. He says, "Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward." Charitable deed, that's not a bad thing. There's people that are going to benefit from different charitable deeds. When you give money to the poor, they benefit from that, obviously. When you provide a meal, somebody benefits from that. But Jesus is addressing the question of why we're doing that. Why do we do those things? Do we do it simply just to get glory from men? And that's what some people were doing. They were going out apparently into the streets and into the synagogues as if to sound a trumpet before them, and they're saying, look at me, look how righteous I am. And that's what made what they were doing wrong. It wasn't the charitable deed, it was the motive behind the charitable deed, that they were doing it to get glory from men. I want us to see that. And I want us to realize what a shame that is, to negate good works with a rotten motive, to do something that's perfectly good and to spoil it because of a selfish motive, and using God for the sole purpose of improving our social status. I did a paper, I think it was one of the first papers that I did when I started here, and it was on the Pharisees and the Sadducees and how that got started. And that's really what the Pharisees and Sadducees were doing. The Pharisees were using God in a way that they could appear righteous to man and to the common man, rather. And then they would kind of lord it over them and say, look how righteous we are, and respect us and look up to us. And then the Sadducees, on the other hand, it was almost just a PR stunt. In fact, some historians question whether or not they truly, genuinely believed in God, but they think that really it was a political move to further their whatever they wanted to achieve politically. And as they were dwelling in these Jewish communities, and they weren't going to be respected by people who didn't believe in God. And what we need to realize is that if that's our attitude, if we're using God, that's eventually going to catch up to us. Do you remember King Amaziah in 2 Chronicles chapter 25? Turn over to 2 Chronicles chapter 25. King Amaziah isn't a king that we would normally turn to say, look at what a great example this person is, as we would with maybe some other kings such as Hezekiah for the most part of his life, or King David in a lot of different respects. Amaziah isn't somebody that we turn over and tell our kids to emulate. But you know what's interesting about Amaziah is that in 2 Chronicles chapter 25 and verse 2, it says that he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, but not with a loyal, or some versions say with a whole heart. You see, as you read through chapter 25, what you come to realize about Amaziah is that as he dedicated himself to God, or didn't dedicate himself to God, but rather was dedicated to his own cause, he did what was right in God's eyes out of convenience to achieve his own purpose. And the moment it becomes inconvenient is the moment that he stops serving God. But even just starting with when he was going in to take over the Edomites and to defeat them, he hired 100,000 men of valor from Israel to help him with that. And then a man of God comes to him and says, God's not with these people. You can't take these men to battle with you, and if you do, you're going to lose the battle. But that wasn't enough for Amaziah. Amaziah said, well, what about the 100 talents of silver I gave them? And then the man of God tells him, well, God will give you more than that. And then upon hearing that, he says, oh, more than 100 talents of silver, that sounds good to me. And then that's when he discharges the men of Israel. And then he defeats the Edomites. And then right after he defeats the Edomites, he takes their gods and he starts offering incense to these false gods that belong to Edom. As if to say, well, God benefited me a lot. Let's see what these gods have to offer. But as we look through that, we see that Amaziah became puffed up, and he and he was constantly seeking to glorify himself, and he turned to the north and looked at Israel and said, I'm going to go take over Israel. That will give me respect, even though he's biting off way more than he could chew in that scenario. And ultimately, Judah is defeated, and then by the time we get to 27, you see that it kind of does a recap, and it says that after he turned away from God, that ultimately they conspired against him in Jerusalem, and he was killed. Amaziah wasn't doing what he did. When he was doing what was right in the sight of the Lord, he wasn't doing it simply because it was an act of righteousness, and because it was the right thing to do, and because it's what God wanted. He was doing it to achieve glory for himself out of convenience. He was following God out of selfish ambition. You know, selfish ambition is rebuked elsewhere in the Bible. If you turn over to Philippians chapter 2 and verses 3 and 4. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3 and 4. Paul says, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but also for the interest of others. This is ultimately what it is about. Esteeming others higher than ourselves. Looking at the interests of our brothers. Obviously, we're not doing that to the extent where we're sacrificing our own faith and relationship with God, but still, we're always looking for ways that we can help our fellow man. This is what it's always been about. That's what Christ was about. As Christ came to this earth, and he wasn't concerned with his own interests as much as he was concerned with our interests as he died on the cross for us. Certainly in that case, he esteemed us better than himself. And we're to emulate that in our own lives as we're trying to be more godly and more Christ-like each and every day. And notice Paul says, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit. I want us to look at that. He uses the term selfish ambition, but what about the word conceit there? You know, that word's only found one time in the entire Bible. This is it right here. The word there is kenodoxia. And in my lexicon, the first definition that came up for that was vainglory. What I want to say this evening, as we're studying God's word, is that self-glory is vainglory. It's empty. It's fleeting. It has nothing to offer, certainly nothing eternal to offer. And it leads nowhere good. If Paul tells us what not to do in Philippians 2, verses 3 and 4, in James 3:16, James tells us why. If you turn over to James chapter 3, verse 16. James says, for where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. Where envy and self-seeking exist, every evil thing are there. I find it interesting that he pairs the two together, envy and self-seeking. Because the two are closely related, aren't they? If you begin thinking about it. As you begin to have jealousy towards your fellow man, you ultimately are comparing yourself to them, and you're starting to look for ways that you can become better than them. And that's where the selfish ambition comes in, and you're willing to do everything just so you can say that you're better than them. And that's all rooted in envy. You know, I was thinking this afternoon as we talk about the Pharisees. We always see the Pharisees in this situation where they're among the common man. And we see how negative of a relationship that is between the Pharisees and the common man of that time. But can you imagine, as they're comparing themselves to these people they feel are lower than them, what it was like when they were amongst themselves in their own group? I would imagine having a group of individuals like that would be what we would call a dog-eat-dog world, basically, is what that is they're all together and they're constantly looking for ways to appear righteous and are constantly one-upping each other, saying, look what I did. Look what I gave. Look how I pray. Look how I fast. It's what led to people such as the Pharisee that we find in Luke chapter 18. If you turn over to Luke chapter 18, verse 9 through 14, and I know it's a little bit of conjecture as I'm talking about these Pharisees and their group, but I can just picture it. I can picture them comparing themselves to each other and the pressure that comes with that and the envy that you develop, and then they go out among the common man and they say, oh, I'm better than this guy for sure. I might not be better than that Pharisee, but I'm better than the guy I'm praying next to, which is a situation that we find in Luke chapter 18, verse 9. Saying of Jesus, also he spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. Jesus gives this parable. He says, 2 men went up to the temple to pray. One a Pharisee, and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus within himself, God, I thank you that I am not like the other men, extortioners, unjust adulterers, or even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. Meanwhile, what does it say about the tax collector in verse 13? It says, and the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Jesus says of this man, I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. We got to start with ourselves. We can't be constantly comparing each other. This isn't a competition that we're in. We're all trying to help ourselves get to the same place, and what are we going to do when we pit ourselves against each other and we make a competition out of it? But it wasn't just the Pharisees that struggled with this, was it? I don't have this in the outline, but we are all familiar with the 12 disciples, and they struggled with this, didn't they? As you turn over to Luke chapter 9 and 46 there, and it says that they were arguing over who would be greatest. They're arguing over who would be greatest. And what does Jesus have to say about that? How does Jesus respond to that as they're disputing? You know, I imagine Jesus saw the Pharisees and the toxicness of what they were doing and that kind of mindset, and then seeing the 12 have this kind of conversation, and what does Jesus say? He says, you want to be first? You want to be great? You want to be righteous? How about this? Be last. Serve God. Serve your brother. None of this, who's greater than who? Jesus condemns this under the old law, so what are we going to do? We're going to be under the new law and start doing that same kind of a thing? We can't do that. Because after all, as we're seeking to have glory from men and maybe be better than the guy that's next to us and have somebody else pat us on the back, at the end of the day, you get what you seek. If you're seeking glory from men, what does it say in verses 1 and 2? Well, in verse 2, it says that of the people who were doing these charitable deeds and sounding a trumpet before them in the synagogues and in the streets, it says that assuredly, Jesus says, assuredly I say to you that they have their reward. If you seek glory from men, okay, that's it. There's your reward. What you see is what you get. But at the same time, what don't you get? You're also missing out on the reward from your Father who is in heaven, as it says in verse 1. He says, take heed that you don't practice your righteousness before men to be seen by them. Otherwise, you have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. And what he says in chapter 6 and verse 21, he says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. What do you treasure? Do you treasure a reward from God, or do you treasure a reward from man? That's where your heart is, and that's where your treasure is, whichever one you choose, because you can't have both. It's a choice. It's glory from men, or it's a reward from God. But what about, or rather, I want to turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Let's turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. If we seek glory from men, what does that say about how we love? It really just says that we love ourselves. It really says that we don't have a love for our brother or a true love for God. And what happens when that's our disposition? When that's our attitude? When that's how we live life? Will we become and start having the same problems that the church in Corinth was having? As we come to chapter 13, Paul is addressing all these different spiritual gifts that they had during that apostolic age. Prophesying and speaking in tongues. And as you read chapter 12, 13, and 14, you get the impression that there was this competition going on, and who has the greater gift, who can speak in tongues, who can prophesy, and if I have this gift, then I'm better than you. What does Paul say in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, 1 through 3? It says, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I've become sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I could remove mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing. You know, going back to the idea that society only cares about the act, they don't care about the motive behind the act. We understand that what Jesus is telling us is contrary to that. Notice the kinds of things that Paul is saying will profit you nothing if you don't have love. In verse 3 it says, even if I bestow all my goods to feed the poor. That's a charitable deed, isn't it? Even if I give my body to be burned. Most people would look at that and say that's righteous. What does Paul say? What does God say? He says if you don't have love, it profits you nothing. It amounts to nothing. So understanding that, we need to, rather than seek glory from men, we understand that we want to seek glory from God. Because if we do that, then we ourselves will have glory one day. And if you turn over to Romans chapter 8 and verse 17, that's exactly what it tells us. Start in verse 16 just to give the verse context. It says, the Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God. And if children, then heirs. Heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. If indeed we suffer with him, that we may also be glorified together. Notice that that's conditional. To be joint heirs with Christ and to be glorified together. It says that's all dependent on whether or not we decide to suffer with him. If you're seeking glory from men, if that's what you're setting out to get, you're not going to be willing to suffer. If we want glory from God and want to glorify God and fulfill his purpose, we have to stop caring about these human rewards, these earthly treasures, and set our minds on the spiritual rewards of God. Therefore what? Therefore, do your deeds in secret. And again, we're talking about the heart and the motive here. Jesus is addressing the mentality that we are to have when we go into these acts. Do your deeds in secret because that's where the Father dwells. That's what it tells us. So that's where our hearts should be, in the secret place with God. And you know what? Some of the most humble people I've ever met, when they receive praise or glory from men, they get real uncomfortable with that. And they're quick to deflect that attention. In some instances, I hear people say, all glory to God. I think that's the right attitude to have. And as you read through the verses, in fact, I know that's the right attitude to have. Any glory that comes to us, we should be quick to deflect it right to God. It begins in our minds. That's where it starts. It begins in our minds. Jesus says in verse 3, he tells us not to allow our left hand to know what our right hand is doing. And I was thinking about that and what exactly he means by that analogy. And my best explanation of it is this, is that as you have the left hand and the right hand denotes what? It denotes strength. It denotes favor. The left hand typically was a sign of weakness, as most people were encouraged to be right-handed. So as I'm thinking about that, I think that the left hand, as it illustrates weakness, that to me is glory from men. That's the side of us that seeks glory from men. But our right hand, as that shows strength, that shows the side of us that seeks to serve God and to glorify God and to seek glory from God. And so what Jesus is saying is don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. When you have this side of you that just wants to serve God and glorify God, he says don't let this side that seeks glory from men even know what you're doing over here. Don't let the left hand know what the right hand is doing. We're seeking to glorify God. And I want to reassure you that God will know what your motive is. Because God knows the heart if you turn over to Jeremiah chapter 17, verses 9 through 10. Jeremiah chapter 17 and verses 9 through 10. He says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? I, the Lord, search the heart. I test the mind, even to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his doings." Who knows the heart? God knows our hearts. And he says, I'm going to give every man according to his ways. So if you have a tendency to seek glory from men, God's going to hand you over according to your ways. But if you seek glory from God, he's going to welcome you with open arms. But he's going to test you. And he's going to know exactly what your heart desires and exactly what your intentions are and exactly what your motivation is as you are doing certain acts of righteousness and trying to please God. So the last point I want to make here is that as we're doing these deeds, it's not that we should just be doing them in secret, but we should also be doing good as we have opportunity. In Galatians chapter 6, verses 9 through 10. Turn over to Galatians chapter 6, verses 9 through 10. Paul says, "Let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of faith." If we're going to do good as we have opportunity, that means that we're going to have to put aside this desire to be praised by men and to receive recognition from men. Because what's going to happen if maybe we're in a situation where it's just me and one other person, and the opportunity presents itself to where I can shine my light and glorify God, but that person is the only person that will ever know about it? There's nobody else that's ever going to see me, that's going to be able to praise me and give me attention for doing good to this one individual. If I seek to have glory from men, I'm never going to do it. That's the problem with this line of thinking and with this motivation, is that really it's disingenuous, but it also leads to an inconsistent faith and service towards God. In fact, what you find is that if you seek glory from men, that's actually going to prevent you from doing good deeds. And as we read this, we shouldn't just be looking at it with the attitude that says, let the good deeds come to me. That's not what we're doing. We want to seek out these opportunities, because the opportunities are out there. They might not be right in front of our face, but they're out there. And it's our job to seek them out so that we can do them. And if we have faith in God, then we have faith that our good deeds are always going to be seen by the highest authority in the universe. And obviously I'm talking about God. And that should be all that matters to us. I want to conclude by turning over to 1 Timothy chapter 1. We can't be like the hypocrites that Jesus talks about in chapter 6, 1 through 4. We must do good with a pure heart and without expecting or wanting praise from anyone except for God, who is in his secret place. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, I want to start in verse 3. It says, "As I urged you when I went into Macedonia, remain in Ephesus, that you may charge some that you teach no other doctrine, nor give heed to fables and endless genealogies which cause disputes, rather than godly edification which is in faith." Then Paul says, "Now the purpose of the commandment is love from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and from a sincere faith." When we do these various acts of righteousness, we need to make sure that we are doing them with love from a pure heart. A pure heart that has no ulterior motives other than just serving God and seeking to glorify God. And as Jesus uses the term of hypocrite in verse 3 of chapter 6, we need to make sure that we aren't hypocrites and that we are doing all these things with a sincere faith, and that we have a sincere faith towards God that is wholly dedicated to serving him and glorifying him only. So if you're here this evening, I know that we haven't talked about the plan of salvation, but if you understand what it takes to become a Christian, you would like to be baptized this evening, then we can start filling up the baptistry right now. Or if you have any other spiritual need, please come forward while we stand and sing the song of invitation.